There are roads in the mountains that seem like they were built for adventure motorcycles. They take you somewhere that feels a long way from everything else. Today I'm riding the Pan America into the mountains along Cove Creek Road, heading toward the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the remote Cataloochee Valley. This is exactly the kind of ride I enjoy. The kind where the destination is important, but the road getting there is just as much a part of the adventure. As I leave the more populated areas behind me, the landscape begins to change. Houses become fewer, the road narrows, and the mountains begin closing in around me. Cove Creek Road winds through the countryside, following the natural contours of the mountains. There isn't any reason to hurry here. This is a road that rewards slowing down and taking it all in. The Pan America settles into its rhythm as I work my way through the curbs. This is where adventure riding really starts to make sense. You're not simply traveling from one location to another. You're experiencing the environment around you. You can smell the forest, you can feel the temperature change as the elevation increases. You hear the engine, the wind, and sometimes nothing but the sounds of the mountains themselves. That's one of the things I love about motorcycle riding. You aren't separated from the landscape, you become part of it. The farther I go, the more remote everything begins to feel. The road seems to disappear into the forest, with one curve leading directly into another. Every once in a while, the trees open up enough to give you a glimpse of the mountains beyond, and then the forest closes in again. It's easy to understand why places like this have drawn people into the mountains for generations. Eventually, the route brings me toward the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The Smokies are a special place for riders. They are not necessarily about speed or aggressive riding. They're about scenery, history, and the feeling of being surrounded by something much bigger than yourself. The mountains stretch in every direction, layered one behind another. And when you're sitting on a motorcycle looking across those ridges, it's hard not to stop for a moment and appreciate where you are. From here, the route continues towards Cataloochee, and that's where the ride really starts to feel like an adventure. After miles of winding through the mountains, the forest eventually begins to open. Suddenly the landscape changes. You've arrived in Cataloochee. Today, Cataloochee feels remarkably isolated, but more than a century ago, this was anything but an empty valley. Cataloochee was actually divided into two communities, Big Cataloochee and Little Cataloochee, separated physically by Nolan Mountain, but closely connected through generations of families and marriages. Cherokee people knew and traveled through this region for hunting and fishing long before European settlement. Permanent European settlement began in the early 1800s, when land owned by Revolutionary War veteran Colonel Robert Love began being distributed for homesteads. Families cleared fields from the forest, they built houses and barns, they planted corn in orchards, they raised livestock. Blacksmith shops, grist mills, stores, churches, and schools eventually appeared, and this remote mountain valley became a thriving community. By 1910, around 1,200 people lived in Big and Little Cataloochee, making it one of the largest communities anywhere in what would eventually become the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. That's difficult to imagine today. When you look across these quiet fields, surrounded by mountains and forests, you have to remind yourself that you're looking at what was once somebody's neighborhood. Children walked these roads to school, families gathered at church, and farmers drove livestock through the valley. Many times, neighbors came together for barn raisings, corn husking, and sorghum making. People met at stores and the post office to exchange news. Even tourism existed here before the national park. Residents stocked streams with trout and rented rooms to visiting fishermen and travelers. But Cataloochee's isolation couldn't protect it from the enormous changes coming to the Smokies. During the 1920s and 30s, land began being acquired for the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. For Cataloochee families, that meant something very different from the scenic overlooks and hiking trails we associate with the park today. It meant leaving home. Some families sold willingly, others were reluctant. Some were allowed to remain for a period under leases, but gradually the population disappeared. By 1938, few of Cataloochee's original residents remained, and over the following decades the forest began reclaiming fields, orchards, roads, and homes. Hundreds of buildings eventually disappeared, but a handful survived, and that's where I'm heading to next. One of the most important surviving places in Cataloochee is the Jarvis Palmer House. The Palmer home dates to approximately the 1860s, making it one of the oldest surviving structures in Cataloochee. The earliest portion began as a log dwelling, with the house enlarged and modernized by later generations of the Palmer family. The name most commonly associated with it today is Jarvis Palmer, although the property originated with his father George Lafayette Palmer. And the Palmers weren't simply just another family living in the valley. They became one of Cataloochee's most prominent families. Walking around the property, you can still see evidence of what a substantial mountain farm this once was. There's the house itself, a spring house, a barn, and other remnants of the Palmer farmstead. The structure is especially interesting because beneath portions of its later exterior are the remains of the earlier log construction. It's almost a physical timeline of Cataloochee. Standing here today, it's easy to imagine this porch being occupied by a family instead of park visitors. And that's one thing I find fascinating about Cataloochee. These aren't reproductions. People actually lived here. A simple pioneer cabin gradually transformed into a more substantial framed farmhouse as the community prospered. The National Park Service later used the Jarvis Palmer House for park personnel, and the property became one of the primary places for interpreting Cataloochee's history. Historical research records the house being used as a park residence for decades after the land became part of the national park. A short distance away stands another symbol of the old community, Palmer Chapel. This simple white Methodist church was built in 1898 and was the only church serving Big Cataloochee. It's one of the buildings that immediately makes Cataloochee feel less like an archaeological site and more like an abandoned town. The architecture is simple: white wooden siding, tall windows, wooden pews. A small bell tower rising above the entrance, nothing elaborate, but for the people living in this valley, Palmer Chapel was one of the centers of community life. Sunday school was generally held every week, while preaching services often occurred only once a month because many ministers serving isolated mountain communities traveled as circuit riders. When the preacher arrived, services could occupy much of Sunday, and every fall came revival. Those gatherings weren't simply religious services. In isolated communities such as Cataloochee, churches were also places where neighbors gathered, families socialized, and relationships extending across generations were reinforced. Today, the pews sit mostly silent, but Palmer Chapel isn't completely forgotten. Descendants of Cataloochee families have continued returning to the valley for reunions and homecomings, keeping a connection with a community that disappeared when the national park was created. Such an event is occurring today. Another remarkable survivor is the Beech Grove School. The National Park Service says the Beech Grove School was constructed in 1901 as a small two-room school serving children in Cataloochee. Education here looked considerably different from what we're accustomed to today. Cataloochee once had 3 schools, and the normal school term was often only about November through January, although additional funding could extend the school year as needed. Students studied reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, geography, and grammar. And Friday afternoons could become something of a community event. Parents would come to the school to watch their children participate in spelling bees, recitations, and singing. Imagine what this place must have sounded like then. Dozens of children, wooden desks, lessons written across blackboards, boots crossing wooden floors. Then compare that with what you hear today. Almost nothing. Just the wind through the trees. Beech Grove is particularly important because although several school districts serve the broader Cataloochee community, this is the surviving school building visitors can see today. It may be one of the simplest buildings in the valley, but perhaps more than any other structure, it reminds you that Cataloochee wasn't merely a collection of isolated farms. This was a genuine community. Families were raising children here and expecting those children to have a future here. They had no idea how dramatically that future would change. Continuing deeper into Cataloochee brings me to one of the most impressive houses remaining in the valley. The Hiram Caldwell House, also known as Caldwell Place. Hiram Caldwell constructed the large frame house between approximately 1903 and 1906. And compared with some of the earlier cabins scattered throughout the Smokies, this place is substantial. It's a 9-room, 2-story house, accompanied by a barn and spring house. The National Park Service describes it as one of the largest historic homes preserved within the park. That's significant because there's a tendency to imagine every Appalachian settler living in a tiny 1-room log cabin. Cataloochee tells a much more complicated story. By the early 1900s, some families here had become relatively prosperous. Sawmills made finished lumber easier to obtain. Commercial agriculture brought income into the valley. Tourism was beginning to develop, and houses such as the Caldwell home reflected that changing economy. Inside, you can still find elaborate woodwork and remnants of old newspapers that were once used as wall covering. Those little details make the building feel strangely personal. You're not simply looking at architecture, you're looking at traces of a family. Someone selected those materials, someone read those newspapers, someone walked those stairs every morning. Children looked through those windows across the same mountains we're seeing today. Outside stands the Caldwell barn, another reminder that despite the size of the house, this was still fundamentally a working Appalachian farm. Today, there's another resident commonly found in these fields. As I ride through the open portions of Cataloochee, there's always a possibility of seeing an elk. Elk had disappeared from this region centuries ago, largely as a result of hunting and habitat changes. Then, beginning in 2001, elk were reintroduced to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Cataloochee became one of the primary locations for that restoration effort, and today the valley is one of the best known places in the Smokies for seeing them. Early morning and evening generally offer the best opportunities. Sometimes you'll see only one or two, other times an entire herd can be scattered across the fields. And during the fall rut, the bugling of a bull elk can echo across the valley. There's something almost poetic about that. People once cleared these fields from the forest. The people left, the forest began returning, and generations later, elk returned as well. Eventually, I climb back onto the Pan America. I fire up the engine, and suddenly that familiar sound feels surprisingly loud against the quiet of Cataloochee. Riding through this valley changes once you know the history. What initially looked like a beautiful meadow begins looking different. I start wondering where the houses once stood, where the fences lined the road, where children walked to school, where somebody's garden grew, and where the blacksmith worked, where neighbors stopped and talked. The National Park Service estimates that around 1,200 people lived here at Cataloochee's peak, surrounded by mountains reaching 3,000 to 6,000 feet. And now nearly all of it is gone. The forest has reclaimed most of the evidence. If you didn't know the story, you could ride straight through Cataloochee and never realize the scale of what once existed here. That's why places like the Palmer House, Palmer Chapel, Beech Grove School, and the Hiram Caldwell House matter. They're more than old buildings, they're reference points. They allow us to look across an apparently empty landscape and begin rebuilding the missing community in our imagination. Eventually, it's time to point the bike pack towards the mountains and leave the valley behind. Ahead is the twisting climb out of Cataloochee in the gravel of Cove Creek Road. It's one of those rides where the return trip feels different from the ride in. When I came down this road earlier, I was looking at the gravel, the curves, and the scenery. Now I'm thinking about the people who traveled across these same mountains generations before motorcycles and automobiles ever appeared here. For them, these mountains weren't something to escape to on a weekend. They were home. Cataloochee reminds us how quickly a populated place can disappear, but it also demonstrates something else. A community can disappear without being completely forgotten. More than a century after children filled the Beech Grove School, more than a century after families gathered inside the Palmer Chapel, and generations after the Palmer and Caldwell families occupied these houses, people are still making the difficult journey across Cove Creek Road to find them. And today, I got to make that journey on two wheels. A little pavement, a little gravel, and a lot of history. Another incredible place hidden in the mountains of western North Carolina. This is exactly why I Moto explore. As always, thank you for watching. Take care, be safe, and I'll see you out there in America on two wheels.